Hi everyone, welcome. I'm getting this sense of deja vu because the bins that I fed yesterday look almost exactly like these two systems here. The systems that I fed yesterday were my original red wiggler worms, but the systems that we're feeding today are not red wigglers. These bins have European nightcrawler worms living in them. And the bins that we fed yesterday also have bubble wrap top coverings. But that's about the extent of the differences. These systems are a little bit younger. Those systems that I checked in on yesterday are about a month and a half older, and I think perhaps 3 feedings ahead of these. These systems, it's been 12 days since we last checked in on them, at which point they got feeding number 20, and today the plan is to come in here with feeding number 21, which is going to consist of the leaves of some radishes. And I had this sneaky feeling like I had something else in here other than just radish leaves, and I was right. Over here I could see the top of a jalapeno pepper, and over here I thought that perhaps, yep, good eye. I'm surprised that I was able to spot it. Yet another chunk of jalapeno pepper, and perhaps the inner core of that jalapeno pepper is floating around in here too. So everything here is frozen. The stuff that they're also getting, which is not frozen, is some coffee. And in this jar, we've got some of my worm chow. So let's proceed to giving these little guys their allotted portion today. Lots of springtails in here. It's almost like it's snowing as I shake them off the plastic top covering. And I have to assume that we're going to have a similar story here. The way we left these systems 12 days ago was that we had rested a couple pieces of coffee filter out here on top, and I see no signs of them. They were kind of like arranged sort of like this. Sort of like the, I don't know if it's the correct way to think about it, like the symbol for a radioactive element or something like that, or hazard sign. But either way, these things were, these filters were opened up and torn in half, and those 2 pieces were placed in here, sort of like this figure 8 shape. And I figured that they'd probably be gone by now, and it seems like my guess was correct. And it makes me wonder, perhaps they're really craving paper products or some form of bedding type materials. The feeding was accompanied with a little bit of bedding too. So when I plopped in their food, I first started out by dropping in the old top covering scraps of newspaper that had been resting out on the top surface that were so far gone already that they were really just tiny fragments of paper that I dropped down into the feeding zone. Then I also took a couple pieces of just fresh, dry newspaper and included those down in the feeding too. From what I remember, the feeding they got last time was mainly potato peel and little chunks of cauliflower leaves, I believe. And typically when I feed potato peel, I do expect to come back and find that the worms have stripped all of the potato off the peel, but the actual outer thinnest section of peel still remains. Perhaps because it's just not as appealing for them to, not so interesting for them to eat as the juicy flesh of the potato. If I'm using the correct words, I'm not sure. And I guess what else are we seeing here? I am bumping into other little scraps of older food items from feedings gone past. This is a little chunk of corn cob. Sometimes I take the corn cob and I slice it into these little discs, and that what we're seeing here is a little leftover piece of that. Doesn't really appear to have made a lot of progress, considering it probably was placed into the bin months ago at this point. Here I see the leftovers of some banana stems. The stuff that they're getting today, the radish leaves, even the inside of the pepper core, I believe will be gone pretty quickly, but the pepper stems usually do take a little bit of time to break down in the worm bins. In fact, over here on the edge, I thought I saw something that might have also been pepper stem. So I wondered if we would have any of those pieces of feeding zone indicator, those pieces of coffee filter out on the surface that we might be able to repurpose as supplementary bedding to go down into the feeding zone. Since there's clearly no sign of it, I don't think that'll be happening. And I even wondered if we'd see any leftovers of the newspaper that got dropped in along with the feeding. I'm not seeing any of that in here either. But then again, we haven't gotten totally into bin number 1 over here. And bin number 2, I saw no sign of the paper products that were included with the feeding, but here maybe we'll still see some scraps. Yep. Just as soon as I was mentioning it, we bump into a little piece of newspaper. I could tell it's newspaper just because of the colored ink that's on it. And here's even a little bit more of it. Kind of makes me wonder why we didn't see any over in bin number 2. Perhaps the reason for that was that maybe the paper had been folded over and it was sort of a double layer rather than just a single layer. So that might be the explanation as to why it remains in here. This, I believe, is just a chunk of corn cob also, but not one that was sliced into little discs. Just one that was put in here as just a tube, if you will, because the inside always gets cored out or hollowed out, and what remains is just a little tube. And no, the corn cob was probably not this diameter. It was probably quite a bit more, so it just feels like the stuff shrinks over time. So I was wondering whether we would possibly want to include a little chunk of supplementary bedding, perhaps another scrap of paper, similar to what we put in here last time. For the most part, what we gave them last time is gone. Or at least I think that the paper that was put in here dry as a single layer vanished, and maybe all that remains here are what was removed from the top surface. The top covering leftovers might be all that we're seeing here, perhaps remaining only because it was folded over. I don't think it's because of the color ink, but who knows. And I guess this might be a little bit more of it. A little bit surprising to see it remaining over here in bin number 1, considering how little of it, or none of it, remained in bin number 2. So I think we've opened up an adequate space into which today's feeding could fit nicely. I did actually consider making today's feeding similar to what I've been doing in some of my other older systems. Before I mentioned my bin of original red wigglers that look very similar to these systems. And in those systems I've been sort of top surface feeding, and I even thought about possibly switching over to that method here in these systems today. But, you know, I think we're okay, kind of sticking to my typical routine of feeding down inside of a little pit that we excavate in the middle. Perhaps in future feedings going forward, maybe next time, maybe we'll switch over to a feeding pattern where I spread the food out a little bit more across the entire system. And usually my reason for doing that, not sure whether it works or not, but my rationale for doing it that way is to try to not focus the energy of the worms into any one given spot within the bin, but rather try to encourage their movement throughout the entire system. So I'm trying to prevent them, not prevent them, but I don't know what the right thinking there is, but not contribute to causing sort of a mobbing behavior and forcing them or luring them into a single spot in the container, but rather giving them the incentive to cruise the entire system and explore all portions of it. So let's proceed with giving them their portion. Let's start out with these jalapeno bits that we found, and I wouldn't be surprised. Here it is. Here's the inside of that other piece. And I think that was pretty much it as far as pepper goes. The rest of this should be, I believe, oh, there we go, famous last words. It's always when I open my mouth that something incorrect pops out. I think that's the only piece of citrus that we've got, and I suppose if I was really intent on being very, very consistent in both systems, I could grab my little pocket knife and split this thing in half. Should we bother? I mean, my knife is right here behind me. And presumably this thing will allow me to split it in half, so some people might be wondering, why is he bothering? What's the difference? There's really not a whole lot of rationale to taking the extra effort, but I just like to try to be consistent when I'm running bins this way with, you know, kind of brother-sister relationships in a way. Almost twin setups. I guess that's the other thing that's pretty close to being the same as the bins that we fed yesterday, which are thought to have exactly the same number of worms living in them. But the difference here, I think, is that I think in one of the bins, perhaps in bin number 1, we had estimated that there were 10 more worms than what live in bin number 2, if I remember correctly. I was just glancing at the estimated worm count for each of these systems before I came down here, and I think that that was the case, but you know, that was how long ago? 227 days ago. Things change, even if there was exactly the same number of worms in both systems when they started. You know, over time, reproduction in one system will probably outnumber the reproduction happening in the other system, so it's pretty unlikely that the numbers are going to remain consistent. Here's another stem of banana. I think that's the other distinction I think that we could probably draw between the systems that I fed yesterday, and at this point people are probably wondering, geez, why is he talking so much about yesterday's feeding? Is he trying to convince me to go watch that system's feeding, those systems' feedings too? Well, I guess I could always put a little link up in the corner of the screen for you if you wanted to go check out yesterday's video, or the bins that I fed yesterday, and tell me what you think in terms of parallels and differences. But I do feel like these systems are definitely not as far along as far as the overall content of the bins not being quite as mature. I see much more in these as far as food leftovers and bedding leftovers. I guess the other weird thing is that here we see lots of springtails, and over there too I guess there's probably some springtails, but the one thing that kind of cruises around in those red wiggler bins I fed yesterday are these little tiny snails. So somehow I always manage to get some sort of a weird anomaly happening in my systems, and for whatever reason springtails seem to be the one thing that stands out as different in these bins. And I don't know, sometimes people even question me, why do you want to reduce your number of springtails, you know? I don't even know how to explain that properly other than personal preference. And I think the other key difference is something I could see when I'm looking at my gloves after plowing through the material, is how much stuff is sticking to my gloves. And it does seem to me like when things are a little bit more moist, that's when things are going to start sticking to my gloves a lot more. And that's something I think that I'm seeing here as well. But for now, you know, if we want to see them polish off all these leftover bits of food scraps and bedding bits that are still floating around in these systems, then we are best off leaving the material nice and damp. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to cruise throughout the entire contents of the bins. So let's use these coffee filters that I showed you earlier as feeding zone indicators. We gave them coffee, but it was straight out of that little carton container. But I do have a little stack of coffee filters over here that I do need to eventually find a use for, and using them as feeding zone indicators this way I think is the perfect way to proceed. And I'm also noticing another thing here, which is just the evidence of my scatterbrain, is the grit that I don't think we used. I don't remember now, but at this point it's too late. We're just going to leave it be. After 20 feedings and now feeding 21 going in here, chances are we've already probably included grit a good many times. So I've got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. Not going to waste your time with that. That's boring. Before I go that quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please Please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.